Yes, thank you, Heike. Thank you, Susanne, for setting this up and giving me the opportunity for the first time ever to attend a webinar. And I have read, I think it was Thierry, who said, well, tell us something new. And well, I'll certainly try. But I don't know how far you are in the topic yet. My approach, as I have been talking with Heike and Susanna before, will be to connect the two leadership issues. One, the outside world, the global diplomacy, and second, the more individual kind of leadership issues. Try to connect those two and also connect the kind of biographical experiences that I have with the development of the climate regime and the challenges that it faces now. Don't expect too much theory because I've spent 4 years now in Parliament, the German Parliament with the Green Party, and I can assure you that there is very little creative thinking that you can do when you're in politics. So I'm really happy now that I can actually do my own thinking now and not rely on staff, on support for some ideas. Well, let's start. I've been involved with leadership issues from the very beginning, I would say. As part of my education, I was doing internships, first with the European Commission of the EC, it was at that time, the European Communities, and second with UNEP, with the Ozone Secretariat, which is located in Nairobi. When I was attending the third meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol, that was in 1990, as a member of the EC delegation, I was stunned because that was really lawmaking in action, and I had never experienced that. I'd never expected that from my studies. You know, there's a famous word by Winston Churchill: if you make sausages or laws, you don't really want to know how this is being done. But certainly, I don't know whether I want to know about how sausages are being made, but I certainly got very, very interested in how laws, international laws, are being made. What kind of rituals, structures help actually in bringing about an effective result, because that's what is important in the end, that it leads to results. These are, when you're concerned with environmental protection, whether it's ozone, whether it's climate, whether it's any other issue, it's important that at the end of the day, there is something that furthers the cause and that actually changes the situation and improves it. So I got interested and actually wrote a PhD on that. It's only available in German, unfortunately. It's called Environmental Regimes in International Law. And I was looking at structures, I was looking at conditions, the specific conditions under which the international negotiations could be successful and facilitate how cooperation is facilitated. I looked specifically at the Montreal Protocol and at the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Unfortunately, the hypothesis that I had that there is new subjects of international law which were being created, that hypothesis did not hold in the end. It's only true in the case of the Montreal Protocol, not in the case of the Basel Convention, and not of any other regime which was built later. It seems that the kind of motivation at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s to create something new, to give up sovereignty of the states to a certain extent, had quickly run out of steam, and by the mid-90s, definitely we were back to the old traditional diplomatic world of sovereign states, which is, if you want to be a little bit polemic, the world of 1648 after the Peace of Westphalia. But there was a short window of opportunity, and that was actually used to fight ozone depletion, the destruction of the ozone layer. And one of the most creative design was that it was a multi-step approach was being used. So there was, first of all, a framework convention where everybody was supposed to be, every state was supposed to be a member, which provided for a very low level cooperation, general cooperation, and good willingness, basically, to further the cause to fight ozone destruction. And then there was a protocol on top of that, which was more specific and which provided for specific targets and for specific commitments for each of the participating states. That was a very, very successful model because in the end you had universal participation in the convention very soon. And then, starting with 24 countries, mostly industrial, you had those who were determined and were required then to phase out ozone-depleting substances. And there was a very intelligent mechanism also to make it possible for majority decisions to be taken and to actually have effect even on those countries that did not vote yes. For all those substances that have been regulated already, they could be strengthened without the consent of everybody inside the regime. That was revolutionary, of course, and has never been repeated anywhere else, but it was very successful. So when I joined the Wuppertal Institut in 1994 and became closely involved with the climate negotiations and with the climate regime, my first approach to the issue was that of the Montreal Protocol, that the convention should actually involve everybody and that there should then be a protocol which would assemble only those states that actually wanted to move forward. So I called it a club approach at that time because it involved a fee, a membership fee. Everybody who wanted to join would have had to take on certain commitments. That idea was not successful because especially the AOSIS countries, the Alliance of Small Island States, they feared that they would be left out then under such conditions and could not have been part of the Kyoto Protocol. And many others supported that. Of course, if you are a little bit creative, there's a multitude of possibilities to actually involve countries at a lower intensity, so to speak. So it would have been perfectly all right to devise a certain entry fee, entrance fee for industrialized countries, which are called Annex 1 under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and to have another set of commitments for countries which are non-Annex 1, which are not industrialized countries. But that was not done at that time, and I have the suspicion that there were some involved in the negotiations who actively fought against a protocol along the lines of the Montreal Protocol because they had seen that it was successful. I must admit that there was a time in the late 90s, at the beginning of the new century, when I thought, well, what's the use of a researcher showing what kind of structures, what kind of procedures, what kind of approaches are successful in international environmental law, if those articles and books are read avidly by those who are opponents of any progress, and then do everything that they can to prevent anything like that to be installed in the new regime. Examples include, for example, in the climate regime, not only majority voting. Most of you will know that there is no majority voting in the climate regime because Rule 42 of the Rules of Procedure, which regulates voting, has never been accepted, so that the proceedings are always done by a provisional application of the Rules of Procedure, and Rule 42 is especially exempted from that provisional application. So within the climate regime, in the Convention or in the Kyoto Protocol, everything has to be done by consensus. That was one way of achieving, of erecting barriers to progress for cooperation in the climate regime. Another very successful feature of the Montreal Protocol were the so-called TEAPs, the Technical and Economic Assessment Panels, where diplomats sat together with people from industry and scientists in order to explore how ozone-depleting substances could be substituted. And they were extremely successful. But of course, any attempt, and there was attempts, to establish these kinds of technical and economic assessment panels within the climate regime were unsuccessful. So that was the situation. We have a Kyoto Protocol where all members of the convention, I think it's all of them, are also parties, which means near universal participation, around 190 countries. That's about every country that exists on this planet, any sovereign country. So what was the, I mean, if you look at the conditions that all countries, even oil-producing countries, which are traditionally very suspicious of any progress in the climate regime. We have countries like the United States, which had from the beginning played the role of a laggard in the regime and tried to hold the process. You have countries like Russia, who are where some part of the government thinks that climate change actually would be a good thing because the warming would allow to grow more food. So you've got countries, parties in the convention and in the protocol, which are not very keen on seeing progress. And looking at that, it's actually one may be a little bit surprised how far the climate regime actually has gone. That we have a Kyoto Protocol, that we have commitments for industrialized countries, for most of them actually, and that for a while it actually looked as if mankind, as if the international society, as if the global community would actually be able to counter the threat of climate change. Then came Copenhagen, and most of you will remember that Copenhagen was a disaster, that there was no result, that the conference, which had been attended by many dozens of heads of states, actually ended with a whimper and did not produce any result. At that time, I was already in Parliament and started thinking. And I quickly came to the conclusion that the breakdown of the negotiations in Copenhagen was not an accident, but that it was a structural deficit that led to this failure. And, you know, I've been kind of emotionally attached to the Kyoto Protocol. I wrote a book on it. I wrote numerous articles on it. I attended every conference of the parties and many of the other meetings which were in between those meetings of the parties. But I'd always said that I would this process was good as long as the base was sound and healthy. And after Copenhagen, I decided that this was not longer the case, because the consensus principle only works towards a certain extent. And as soon as the going gets tough, those parts of industry who want to prevent progress, and those countries which have been traditionally alien to the process, they get the say and manage to hold up the whole process. My next line of thought was, okay, so what can we do inside of the climate regime to allow, for example, groups of countries to act as forerunners, progressive countries who actually want to move forward, and there's quite a lot of them. But it quickly turned out, and I had a small study done by an international lawyer from Ecologic. It quickly turned out that this was not the case, that it was almost impossible within the climate regime to establish a group of forerunners without the consent of anybody else. So then my attention turned to processes outside of the convention, and I commissioned a small study by the World Resources Institute, which was done by Jennifer Morgan and Lutz Weicher, to explore possibilities for climate clubs outside of the climate regime. This study was ready in last summer, and my idea was to have this as a blueprint then to put into practice. What we identified was a club called the Solar Economy Club. The material, I think, was distributed and put on the website before, and some of you may have actually looked at it. Yes, I see Heike is posting that it has been uploaded. The Solar Economy Club for us had that was a shining expression that would actually show that this club was oriented towards the future. It was based on a concept devised by the late Hermann Ott, who was one of the forerunners of the renewable energy revolution. His idea of the solar economy, which included not only solar power, photovoltaics or concentrated solar power, but in his vision of the solar economy, also wind, biomass and others, which are indirectly, of course, also solar sources of power, that was included, and that's how we devised this too. Our idea was, excuse me, I've got a bit of hay fever here. Our idea was to install a club that would have an entrance fee, because the entrance fee, which is commitments, would allow only those countries into the club that were determined to actually move forward and go ahead progressively. So we devised a list of criteria which had to be fulfilled in order to be members. And we devised a model of 3 stages, how this could be set up. It is my firm conviction that at the next conference of the parties, the next big one, which is going to take place 2015 in Paris, that the results will be quite unsatisfactory. It may be that there will not be a complete breakdown, as it happened in the Copenhagen, but I fear that the results might be far from what is necessary if we want to successfully tackle climate change, if we want to successfully keep our planet below a 2-degree warming in the global average. And so the club idea, to establish a club outside of the climate regime, serves at least 3 aims, 3 goals. One is, of course, to establish international cooperation of leadership countries who can actually move and show to the world that it is possible, and use all the synergies which arise if countries of very different size, different societal organization, and different systems cooperate. And this is certainly the main goal, the main objective. But there's another one. For example, to provide a kind of a safety net if the negotiations in Paris would really break down as they had done in Copenhagen. And it took, well, 2 years for international climate diplomacy to actually recover from that shock in Copenhagen and to get back on track. So to provide for a safety net where it is clear that there is another process that can actually lead to results. And there is a third objective, and that is competition is always a good thing if you want to achieve results. And I have been told by people who have been involved in the negotiations that already the announcement of the former German Environment Minister, Peter Altmaier, to establish a club, a renewables club, has made some waves in the negotiations and has led to increased activities. You know, this club, which consists of, I think, 9 or 10 countries, is not the ideal instrument that we devised. I remember that I talked to the former environment. I remember that I talked to the minister, who hasn't done it, his name was Norbert, the former minister, about the idea of establishing a club, who hasn't done it, but the former minister Altmaier actually took up the idea. And but what we see so far is not really satisfactory, because there's no specific criteria, and that would actually determine who can join and who cannot. It's a rather arbitrary group so far, and it's not yet clear what kind of goals and objectives are supposed to be achieved by that group. But it is a start, and I sincerely hope, and I will talk to the present Environment Minister, who is Barbara Hendricks, to improve the club that has been started by her predecessor and come up with something. Because who should lead? And if you look at the international scene, there is probably not that many countries who can lead. Germany is one of them. And there's, I mean, if you look at the leadership theories, I mean, there's very different types of leadership that are possible. One, there is a very basic concept of leadership, which is pure power. So any country which is strong enough in political and military terms can exercise this power and exert leadership in this sense. But neither Germany nor the European Union as a larger body are able to exert this kind of leadership. And actually they don't want it. There's a very different approach to leadership in the European Union. There is a second concept of leadership, and that's what you might call diplomatic leadership. It's political, by networking, by making advances, by facilitating cooperation in order to achieve certain results. Canada, for example, has always been a very good example of a country that exerts leadership in this kind of sense, in the political and diplomatic sense. For example, there would be no international criminal court without Canada taking a lead on that, almost single-handedly and with the support of some other country. That is a kind of leadership that the European Union and Germany can do, and which they have done with more or less success in the past. A third concept of leadership I would call directional leadership, and that is leadership by example. And in this sense, of course, Germany is, or used to be, a very good leader, because what also in English is sometimes termed energy Wende, the turnaround of the energy system that has been initiated in 2000 already, so it's much older than just a couple of years. This energy turnaround, energy revolution, I would rather call it, has shown that a single-handed turnaround is actually possible. I remember very well, and some of you in the energy business will do, that it's not so long ago, maybe 12, 15 years, that it was by eminent experts, it was held that it was completely impossible for any electricity grid to contain more than 3 or 4% of renewables in it, because they were too much fluctuating and couldn't be dealt with in the system. Well, you know that Germany by now has more than 25% of renewable energy in the grid, and without any breakdown, and of course no shortage of energy. If the current government, the current coalition, pursues a course that will lead to a deepening of the current energy turnaround, I'm sure that we will show that 100% renewable energy is possible, and that not only in the electricity sector, but also in the rest of the energy sector, and especially also the transport sector. Now I should quickly ask our organizers how much time I have left. And Heike, Susanne?
Yeah, I would say just come to a quick wrap up, because we're about 5 minutes over time. I didn't want to interrupt you. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. So perhaps you can make a short wrap up, and also perhaps with your own statement of what we said. What is your leadership motivation behind all those issues now? Where do you post yourself? That would perhaps be an interesting last comment.
Okay. Great. Well, to wrap up, we don't know whether it will be possible to organize international cooperation and diplomacy to an extent that it will actually make a difference, and that we will stay below 2 degrees centigrade. You know that the IPCC has published 2 reports. The third will be due next Monday, will be presented here in Berlin, dealing with the adequate responses and measures towards achieving the 2 degrees target. Time is short, and there is no guarantee that we will do it. There are some developments that are extremely adverse, especially the rise of coal in countries like China, Australia, but also parts of the United States before the fracking boom. That is actually helpful a little bit in this respect. There are very strong interests, industrial business interests, who want to prevent any progress on this issue. It's not a coincidence that in the United States it's Exxon and the Koch brothers who are spending most on supporting so-called climate skeptics in order to sow the doubt on this whole issue. And if you look at the politics of the United States, you see that they have been successful. Similar approaches you can see in the European Union at the moment, and even in Germany, where there are some lobby groups who are employing rather similar techniques, and they have been successful in the United States. So as I said before in a different context, the opponents of change are very active and will not make it easy. Important is determination to be successful. I think the anti-nuclear movement in Germany has shown is offering a very good illustration of how a small part of the population, a very small part of the population, can actually change the whole climate of a society, can change the society and can change the face of that country. It was not many who started 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and were convinced all over the decades that nuclear power is lethal, cannot be controlled, and is something that a legacy that we should not leave to our children, grandchildren, and so on. But by constantly making themselves heard, by constantly making noise, by developing technologies, small-scale technologies like wind power, like photovoltaics, it was some kind of some kind of madmen who at first developed these technologies because they were thought to be nutters and not to be taken seriously. But they have changed the world, and it was because of their conviction that we had to get out of the nuclear and the fossil complex. So I think, and in the end, they won. We won, and in the end, we have a phase out of nuclear power, not only in Germany, but we see it in other countries too. That example, I think, provides us with a model of how to be successful. We need a certain group, a certain number of countries, a certain percentage, who are very vocal, and in any discussion, any time that the subject comes up, make their voice heard and are very firm on this. And that can actually change the world. And I would like, and that drives me, definitely. And I would like to end with a quote from the French writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and because he said, "Our task is not to predict the future. Our task is to make it possible." And that drives me, and I suspect that it drives you too. Thanks a lot, and I'm happy to discuss with you.